ThinkTech is back. I'm Jay Fidell. This is American Issues Take Two. And today, as in earlier weeks, we're going to focus on Ukraine because we feel that Ukraine is very important to America and to the free world. And our co-host is Tim Apicella, who will join us, and Manfred Henningsen, emeritus retired political science professor from UH Manoa, very familiar with things in Europe. Right after this. Now, welcome to the show, Tim. Nice to have you here, and Manfred, nice to have you here. Although I have to say, this is for me, this is a sad and depressing subject, but I think we have to cover it. The title of our episode is called "The Killing Continues in Ukraine," the tagline is "We should not be distracted from the tragedy," because there is tragedy happening every day. We are watching from the sidelines, in large part, the destruction of a society and a country. Very, very troublesome. And to see this continue to happen every day, now for a year, and Vladimir Putin gets away with it. And unbelievable propaganda, lies, unbelievable aggressive actions against civilian populations. This is war crimes right in front of our eyes. So, Tim, how do you feel about this? We have last night there were 81 missiles that hit their targets from Russia all across Ukraine, and it's a technology the Russians haven't used that much, but now they're using it. It's hypersonic, and it's taken a toll. How does this change the calculus?
Well, if you look at it from a resource standpoint, I actually was very surprised that you were using hypersonic missile technology, because those are fairly expensive missiles to have to launch, and they're hitting civilian targets or other targets that affect civilian population. So I was really surprised that they were using those. As I said before the show came on, it is not good that the nuclear plant in Zaporizhia was knocked offline for the 6th time. And that means that it has to rely on auxiliary power to ensure that the cooling rods stay cool and not overheat and have another Chernobyl type incident. So that's very disconcerting, and that plays into the calculus. It's not Putin using a tactical nuclear weapon, but he's using by de facto a nuclear plant that could go offline and heat up and blow up. So yeah, it does change the calculus, and I guess we just wait to see what's the next progression here.
Manfred, the Wagner Group has taken the east side of Bakhmut, and they claim that it won't be long before they take all of Bakhmut. And the news on the Ukrainian side is, they could make a fast withdrawal and ultimately and soon, leave Bakhmut to the Wagner Group. How does that change the calculus?
Well, I don't know, whether the Russian news is completely true. You have in both, the battle over Bakhmut is now longer than the battle in Stalingrad, in World War II. And it has become a symbolic battle. And the way, the Ukrainians hold on to whatever they are now still in charge of at Bakhmut is quite remarkable. So for that reason, I do not think the battle is over. And even if it's over, it will continue. So for that reason, one should look at Bakhmut more as a symbol than a real military issue. And what you have, when you're looking at the Ukrainian side, is the incredible confidence that the soldiers have in their own ability, to withstand the Russian assault. I mean, it's absolutely remarkable when you watch that. despite, all of the misery that they are going through. I mean, in a way, you could say what this war, this trench war, not only in Bakhmut, but in other parts, remind you of is World War One, and the Oscar competition of that German movie, All Is Quiet on the Western Front, simply the images of that movie, if you have seen it, simply reinforces what you are watching, in Bakhmut and in other places in the Ukraine today. So I'm not that pessimistic.
Oh, well, we haven't covered all the factors yet. Maybe when we cover all the factors, Manfred, you'll be less optimistic. Let's go to other factors that are happening on the ground. Although I certainly agree with Manfred, Tim, that we have great courage on the part of Zelensky and the Ukrainian people. To the world, they present a face of courage, of strength, of collaboration, togetherness. It's actually a beautiful picture, and it will be remembered whatever happens. On the other hand, their country is being destroyed around them. I see this as a repetition of Aleppo, where you stand in the middle of what used to be a city, and you look at rubble, and you ask yourself, how could anybody live in this? Where would they get water, food, plumbing? Anything. How can they live? And they're not there, actually, in so many communities, so many former, quiet Eastern European towns in Ukraine. They're not there. They've gone. And there's a straggler who refuses to leave, and the press takes a picture of that person. But in fact, they're all gone, and their buildings are destroyed, and their infrastructure is destroyed. There's no food. There's no water. It's a picture of Aleppo. So while Zelensky and his lieutenants and his heroic troops around him, which we have to give credit for, while all of that, and while the press reports, all these war crimes happening all around, the fact is that Ukraine is being systematically destroyed. Its infrastructure, its residential structures, its people. It's really awful when you think about it.
But let me intervene there. I do not accept your comparison with Aleppo. Aleppo is a city with, you could say, no future, whereas Ukraine's future is membership in the European Union. And the worse the situation becomes for the Ukraine, the closer this membership will come. I mean, the newly elected president of Estonia made this point very clearly, very recently. And I think in that sense, comparing the Ukraine, any city in Ukraine with Aleppo, I think is somewhat misleading.
Oh, I understand what your point, but your point is based on promises. We got promises.
No, it's not. No. I think it's not promises.
We're going to rebuild. We're going to bring in the engineers, the architects.
Yeah, that's what happened.
We're going to spend hundreds of billions rebuilding a country that has been knocked down to the ground.
Right.
Based on promises, Manfred.
Well, look, that was, remember what happened to Germany after 45. I mean, Germany looked like Aleppo, or many of the cities looked like Aleppo. And you have then not only the Marshall Plan, but you have the support for the reconstruction of the German economy, not only from within, but from neighbors as well. So in that sense, you should compare, I think, the situation of the Ukraine more with what the situation of Germany was in May 1945.
Okay, Tim, this is your turn. You want to do counterpoint on that?
No. Manfred took exactly every word I was ready to say. He's exactly spot on. You'll see a Marshall Plan of sorts. It won't be just the EU that will rebuild Ukraine. You'll see the United States as a partner in this, because we're all partners to make sure that Putin doesn't expand his grasp and his tyranny and his fascism to other nations of Ukraine. This is the place where we stop Putin, and that's called Ukraine. So,
let me take the counterpoint on you both.
all right.
We have Kevin McCarthy. He doesn't want to meet with Zelensky. We have a whole bunch of Republicans in the House and probably the Senate who don't want to give any money. And Joe Biden has a budget with $7 billion more for them that has to pass Congress. No money, no ticket, no laundry. What's going to happen here is the American Congress, which is dysfunctional, is going to be very reluctant to give any more money or support to Ukraine, and it is de facto the leader, okay, of the coalition, the alliance of the EU and NATO. If the U.S. goes off the side on this, what effect on these promises? What effect on these promises for weapons, for ammunition, for money? You can't fight a war without money, and I think there's a pipeline problem there.
Right.
So you have a war that could be a war, just as Putin wants, of continuing long-term attack, like, may I say, like Aleppo, where at the end of the day there is no Aleppo, and at the end of the day here we run the risk of having no Ukraine, except promises of the Marshall Plan. And let me say, Manfred, that 1945 or 6 or 7, when the Marshall Plan came into, and when Germany, got its act together and did remarkable things in rebuilding itself, it's not the same situation. And those promises may not come true. I'll say it again. Go ahead, Tim, your reaction.
All right. Well, first off, yes, we're talking about $7 billion. We've already committed over 45 and more $1 billion to Ukraine and have delivered on a lot of those monies. So in comparison, 7 billion, it really is kind of a drop in the bucket. And I don't think it's a sticking point for us not to continue to support Ukraine. I think the greatest thing that one might do, or Joe Biden should do, and I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, is he uses the bully pulpit to basically remind the GOP that they were in support Ukraine. And we remember the State of the Union speech where everyone stood up to commit that they wouldn't touch Medicare and Social Security. Well, there were many other meetings where all the Republicans and Democrats stood when they were talking about support for Ukraine. I think that support's still very high. You've got the tail wagging the dog here with the MAGA GOP, decrying that monies need to be dedicated to the United States and not Ukraine. And I think that's a minority voice right now. Yes, they're gaining a little bit of progress in their protest to support Ukraine, but it's still a minority vote.
One more point, and that is Trump at CPAC referred to Ukraine, and what he said was that if he was in office, we wouldn't have this problem. The I alone can fix it approach.
He alone could give Ukraine to Putin. Yes, I agree with his statement.
You're absolutely right. Yes.
That's a pretty funny comment. But, to what extent does Trump's success link to action or non-action about Ukraine?
Look, I do not think that Trump plays a role in all of this. It becomes a question of American honor and identity. And Biden can play that card, I think, perfect in order to make the people see, how the Republicans are, in a way, abandoning this American identity if they do not continue to support Ukraine.
Are you saying
Can I jump on that
America has an identity these days?
I think
that's a little over the top.
Well, I think in this issue, yes. You may think it's a fractured identity, but I do think that when it comes to confronting Putin, and his assault, it's not only an assault on the Ukraine, but I think it is an assault on the West as a whole.
I hear you, but I think that the people in the red states don't hear you.
Well, I don't. I think that is something that Biden can fix, or he should fix. And the people who support him, I think they can, in a way, remind these red state Americans what America at its core is really all about.
Well, it could be a great gathering point, but Tim, is it a matter?
Jay, let me just tag Jay just for 1 second. Let me just tag on to what Manfred said. You know, we have a huge black eye on the way we pulled out of Afghanistan.
Yes.
This is quite the different level of support. This is really going back to really a good versus evil type of thing of that America and the EU needs to engage themselves in. We're talking about huge war crimes as Putin is trying to take over Ukraine, and it's no longer just a battle. It's the fight for good versus evil. And yes. I think that Joe Biden uses the bully pulpit effectively enough. He'll be able to convince the GOP that fight is worth fighting.
Okay.
There are enough left in the Republican Party, I think, who will follow that line of argument.
Okay. What about the 28 tanks that I think it was Germany said they were going to provide by the end of the month? This is the month of March, and it has 2 weeks to go yet or more. Is that soon enough? You know, we've had a lot of rhetoric, a lot of guys standing around with flags behind them, shaking hands and promising they were going to support Ukraine. You know, national leaders hither and yon, meeting all over the place, and half the cabinet, the American cabinet, has been to Ukraine to show support. But is that it? That's rhetoric. What about action, Tim?
Well, remember, tanks don't drive themselves. So it's not just an issue of delivering the tanks. It's the issue of making sure that they have personnel to operate those tanks effectively and successfully on the battlefield. So I think the training has been done, and now the tanks are ready for delivery to be put into use. 28 is a start. I mean, obviously, it should be 128, should be 228. And of course, our Abrams tanks should be on the field, but that's going to take months. But it's a start. You have to start somewhere.
The delivery issue, you know, that played a major role. You have to also see that in the context of German politics. You know, you have a lot of peaceniks on the right side of the German political spectrum and on the left side. I mean, Germany after World War II became a pacifist country. And you have a signature campaign. 700,000 people have already signed this anti-war manifesto. So you have a very touchy political climate in Germany when it comes to supporting war. And now you have this crazy possibility, you know, that the Ukrainian sabotage group blow up the two pipelines. Now, these two pipelines do not do anything at this point. No, they have attacked Nord Stream 1 and 2. But they don't, I mean, they don't play a role any longer in German gas supply, because Germany built these delivery institutions at harbors for liquefied gas. So
well, we don't know for sure that they did that, but
right, we don't.
Assuming for a moment that it will be confirmed, because it seems like it's going there. Was it a mistake? How bad a mistake was it? How does it affect the larger view of the problem?
Well, you can understand why they did it, but if you then get, in addition to the confirmation of it being a Ukrainian sabotage group, the information that that Zelensky's government was somehow supportive of it, that is bad PR work, and it will have a tremendous, it will have a negative impact in Germany. And slow, you know, the delivery of weapons. But in the long run, I do not think it will stop any of that. The support in Germany is still strong. I mean, it's not 100%, but it is strong.
Well, is Olaf Scholz strong enough to say, I'm going to do the right thing here? I'm not going to worry
with
about
the support of the Greens, yes. I mean, the Greens are stronger, you could say, than Scholz, which is also a very strange phenomenon in German politics. You have now the old leadership of the Green Party, you know, who are as old as we are, in the late 70s and 80s, and they criticizing the young leaders of the Green Party, you know, for being bellicose. It's absolutely extraordinary when you watch these battles, you know, in the Green Party. But I think the majority of the Greens are supporting the support for the Ukraine.
I want to talk about social psychology, Tim. I want to talk about Putin's war of, what's the word, continuing war. And he feels, and I think everyone feels, that that his best maneuver is a war of attrition. His best maneuver is to keep it going for as long as possible, to keep destroying infrastructure, to keep, you know, destroying morale, which is what he's got to be doing. Whatever Zelensky says, he's got to be destroying morale. You know, isn't that a winning strategy? At some point, you know, Ukraine has got to collapse. And remember also that Putin never operates on one level only. This is multi-layered. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I'm sure the green issue in Germany is being fomented by social media that's generated out of Moscow in the IRA, Internet Research Agency of his, you know, that hacks and that, you know, that tries to divide societies all over the place by social media, destructive social media messages. So my question, I will get to it. My question is there some point here where the war of attrition will win?
Yes, but he can't afford to get to that point. And I agree that he is trying to, you know, basically wait them out and a war of attrition, but more importantly, try to win the hope that support for Ukraine will diminish either through Congress in the United States or elsewhere in the EU. So yeah, he's very hopeful of that, but he needs a victory and he needs one now. These losses that Russia is, you know, taking on, over 200,000, and certainly the sanctions, you know, I'm sure things at home are not as rosy as one might imagine for Vladimir Putin. So he needs a victory, and he needs one soon. And I think he'll try to get that in the spring campaign, but we'll see. That question is yet to be answered.
If he takes
the longer this war lasts,
use that as a victory.
The more problematic his position in Russia itself will become.
Correct.
So the war, I mean, it's a war of attrition for Putin in Russia itself.
That's true, and I wanted to ask you about that, Manfred. How's he doing in Russia? You know,
well, not very good.
Various elements we've been following. You know, all the young professionals leaving town, right, including the press. I get Medusa.io every day. They tell me truth about what's happening in the war and in Russia. On the other hand, there's a lot of people in jail. Navalny is still in jail. He's still got his oligarchs surrounding him. He's still got he's beating off the sanctions. He's campaigning and advocating for Russia all over the world. He's involved in a multi-layered effort to keep the Russian people in place. So where are we on that? And at what point do we reach either regime change or policy change?
Well, look, you have all kinds of counter phenomena taking place in Russia. Within the elites as well within society as a whole. You know, the thousands of corpses that have come back to Russia have a tremendous impact, you know, on the support the war, and the casualties, you know, the wounded people that come back. So you have, I mean, and in many of these corpses are not sent home immediately, so they are holding somewhere. But what is, you know, the Russian military has shown how underperforming they really are compared with the Ukrainian. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. Here you have the country that is attacked by a superpower, and the superpower shows how weak its military structure is. Now, I don't know whether you saw on CNN this interview with Navalny's daughter 2 days ago, in our interview. Absolutely wonderful. I mean, she is an undergraduate at Stanford, and she was interviewed together with the Canadian guy who made the movie, the Navalny movie, and then the researcher who was making all of these intriguing discoveries, about who tried to kill Navalny. And one of the most fascinating points, was not only the confidence that Navalny's daughter showed about the situation in Russia, but the observation that these two movie makers made. And they said, if 12 people were incapable of killing Navalny, what does it tell you about the competence, of the Russian state? And you must admit, these 12 people were not trying to kill Navalny together. They were separate attempts. But the incompetence, you could say, of the Russian security state simply reaffirms the incompetence of the military. So what you have, and then you have the economic problems that Russia is confronted with within. So what you have there is a state that is underperforming on all levels. And you cannot, a country like Russia cannot survive for a long period of time, under those circumstances.
Well, we thought that the sanctions would stop it, but they haven't stopped it.
But they contribute simply.
And we thought that his efforts to make puppet governments around the other satellite countries would ultimately dissipate, but they haven't. I mean, Lukashenko, for example, enacted a law here yesterday that anybody who speaks against him gets the death penalty in Belarus. And this is pretty troublesome, and that comes from Putin. So what I get though, Tim, is we have these conversations, and the news is filled, and it's filled with fragments of this, all over the world. But what I think we forget is the original outrage we felt in February and March of 2022. How dare Putin do this? How dare he invade a neighboring country and with physical force and violence and weapons with no provocation whatsoever? A peaceful country. How dare he do that? It was complete outrage. And now, sort of the narrative has changed, and we talk about other things somehow. But I'm wondering, are we beginning to tolerate this? And when we first learned about his war crimes and how he was raping women and children and kidnapping, young people off to Russia, how he was engaged in any number of war crimes. I mean, the whole gamut, the whole inventory of war crimes is here right now. Are we getting hardened to that? And I'm very worried that the narrative is moving on and people are not as outraged as they were or should be.
Great point. I mean, it's the human condition, unfortunately, when you're delivered repeated messages of horrific actions and war crimes, there's something called being desensitized. It happens. And I think support for Ukraine really accelerated when there was the discovery of war crimes. And I'm trying to remember the name of the city, not far from Kiev.
Bucha.
Bucha, yeah, thank you. And boy, once that discovery was made and publicized, support for Ukraine just really went off the rails and it just really took off. But then you're right, Jay, is that this has now gone on for over a year. And especially the American public, where they have the attention span of a gnat, and we're in a 24-hour news cycle on everything. It does have an impact, and people do become desensitized. But I think deep down, people have said this is, as I said earlier, this really is a conflict between good and evil, and there are many Americans that are comparing this evil of Putin to the evil of Hitler, and certainly comparing the invasion of Ukraine to that of September 1st, 1939, the invasion of Poland. So there are comparisons that Americans are using to say, it's not our war, but it really is our war, and it's Europe's war. And I think that's what will keep the public opinion polls positive for the support of Ukraine.
Yeah, but look, there is something else that you have to really be aware of. What this invasion has shown is this unbelievable attraction of the European Union. You know, you have these, not only these demonstrations for the membership in the EU, in the Ukraine, but you saw these mass demonstrations in Georgia over the weekend. And there you suddenly saw European flags being waved, and the people that were interviewed made all the same comments. So what you have there is almost the Maidan situation, 2014 in Kiev. You have that now in Georgia. So what you have there is this interesting geopolitical situation that these former republics of the members republics of the Soviet Union want to become part of the European Union. You know, the attraction is stunning. And then you have the interesting thing also, the various Stan countries, Kazakhstan, and all of these former Asian republics of the Soviet Union. They are not in a hurrah mode like Lukashenko. They hold off and have not come forward as supportive as Putin had hoped for. And remember, whatever you may think of the Indian fascist Modi, he has not come out in full support of Putin either. And whether Xi Jinping, will completely become an ally in this war is not completely clear. So, the global reach of Putin has its limits.
Well, let me take it a step further, Manfred. We know that this is a remarkable event. It's a remarkable event in human history, not just now, but casting a long shadow. We know that it affects everybody everywhere. So many countries are watching and listening and waiting and maybe taking sides. And now we know also that until this happened, there was a perceptible move to autocracy. And I'm thinking not only of Viktor Orban, I'm thinking of Latin America. I'm thinking of so many, Turkey. I'm thinking of so many countries that were moving right to autocratic governments. So now on top of that, and maybe to even displace it, we have this response to what's going on in Ukraine. And arguably people see the EU and democracy in a more tangible light, because they take a close look at what Ukraine means. So my question to you, Manfred, is this. Is this changing the direction? Is this kind of new protest democracy, if you will, such as in Georgia and elsewhere, is this going to affect the trend we saw earlier toward autocracy?
Look, for me, the most interesting thing is, I didn't know anything about Ukraine until 2016, when I was traveling there from Lemberg to Odessa for 2 weeks and talking to intellectuals all over the place in German or English. And for me, the most fascinating thing was this identity, this Western, this European identity that all of them articulated. And it was, for me, surprising. And for that reason, I think this war has, in a way, contributed to the political self-understanding identity of the European Union as a political entity, which it didn't have in this sense.
Very interesting, very interesting.
Before.
So, Tim, I want to ask you the same question about the U.S. We've seen, in the Trump years, a remarkable, emergence of conservatism, serious right-wing, crazy conservatism, and still it's there. But this war, and it is seeping into our national consciousness, no matter what Kevin McCarthy does, no matter what Trump does, no matter what the base does, people around the country are learning that there's a travesty going on in Ukraine. And whatever detail, there's enough there to reach the consciousness of millions and hundreds of millions of people. So my question, this is not easy, but it's the same question I asked Manfred. Is this war and the reaction of the American public going to have an effect on the American identity?
I think it is. It's helpful as we battle our own, preservation of democracy and the rule of law. So yes, it's a comparison that many Americans can make, that democracy is worth fighting for. Democracy is worth paying American taxpayer dollars to fund for ammunition and weapons of war. And so yes, in some, you're right, Jay. That question's excellent. It's in a way to help Americans understand the value of their fight for democracy throughout the last 245 years. It's a great reminder that democracy and the rule of law can be taken relatively easy by a despot. And, Trump is that despot. And I just want to add one other thing is that, what Trump had for a cult following in 2016, by 2024 is greatly diminished. And part of Trump's charm was a wedge issue of isolationism for America. Well, as his cult following has diminished, so goes the idea of isolationism.
Yeah, and Ukraine helps us understand not only what democracy means, but what it doesn't mean. What I mean is, if you don't have democracy, then you have Ukraine. Okay, that's not a pleasant picture. Okay, time for final comments. Manfred, we only take profundities. Are you ready?
Yes.
Go for it.
I am not as pessimistic as you are. I think that Putin is maybe in the same kind of trouble he thinks Zelensky is in. So this war has really an impact on Russia that he didn't anticipate, despite the fact that you have in Russia as many nationalist nuts as you have in this country. So for that reason, do not underestimate the self-destruction of Putin's Russia as a result of having invaded Ukraine. The death toll, the Russian death toll, has begun to have an impact.
Okay, Tim, your turn.
Okay, well, given the conversation here this morning, I believe that the preservation of Ukraine and its democracy will prevail, of course, contingent upon the continued support of the EU and the United States. I also feel that once Putin is rejected and been rebuked from Putin's war into Ukraine, I believe the promise of rebuilding Ukraine will remain solid by the EU and the United States.
Okay, all I want to add to that is that when we started our Trump Week program 5 or 6 years ago here on ThinkTech, we were focused on Trump and the violence he was doing to American institutions. And we weren't talking much about, Europe or Eastern Europe. Now it has become very important to follow that. And we will continue to follow it because it has huge effect all over the world and in the US. It is as much a part of American issues as anything else. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you to my co-host, Tim Apicella, and to our esteemed guest, Manfred Henningsen, for this very important discussion. Aloha.
Aloha.
Thank you so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, please like us and click the subscribe button on YouTube and the follow button on Vimeo. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and donate to us at thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.